Chapter 2. Heresy. Isaac La Peyrère in the pre-Adamite scandal. In February 1656, 30 armed men reportedly burst into the Brussels lodgings of an emissary of the Prince of Condé and hauled him off to prison. 4 months and multiple interrogations later, the prisoner agreed to be escorted to Rome in order to recant of his heresies and be received into the Catholic Church. On January 17 the following year, Isaac La Peyrère, a Calvinist of Portuguese Jewish origins from Bordeaux, arrived at the Vatican to meet Pope Alexander VII, who reportedly welcomed this man who was before Adam and roared with laughter while they read together La Peyrére's monumentally heretical treatise, Adamite, Men Before Adam. It was on Christmas Day just over a year earlier, 1655, that the book had been denounced by the Bishop of Namur, just a month after its condemnation by the President and Council of Holland and Zeeland, and since then its author had received nothing but critical censure. Within a year of the book's publication, more than a dozen refutations had appeared. Everyone, it seems, hated it. Born in Bordeaux in 1596, or thereabouts, into a wealthy and influential Protestant family, La Peyrère had already been embroiled in ecclesiastical controversy. At the age of 30, he was accused of atheism by one of the local synods of the French Reformed Church, though the charges were dropped. Ever since then, La Peyrère, a qualified lawyer, had been in the service of the Condé family, enjoying its patronage as their fortunes permitted, and had also been part of a French diplomatic mission to various European countries. Even though La Peyrère had been tinkering with his pre-Adamite heresy for 15 years or more, so long in fact that the circulated version of the manuscript had called forth an extended critique from Hugo Grotius in 1643, he had already established himself as an expert on Greenland, and later Iceland, before pre-Adamite made its formal appearance. Some reflections on these inquiries into the geography of the northern regions and their significance for La Peyrére's enduring skepticism is a suitable point of departure, not least on account of their connection with the whole issue of the peopling of the Americas. Northern Geography and the Path to Skepticism. On June 18, 1646, La Peyrère put the finishing touches to a letter to François Lamotte Leverre, a skeptical French generationalist and, like La Peyrère himself, a member of a circle of intellectuals enjoying the patronage of the Prince of Condé. This was the second such letter La Peyrère had sent to the same individual. The first one, an account of Iceland, had been completed in 1644, but its contents were not published until 1663. The present treatise, on Greenland, appeared in Paris in 1647. Taken together, these 2 volumes established their author's reputation as a leading authority on the northern regions until well into the 19th century. This account of Greenland, while providing a regional description of the country's features, equally approached a number of the larger issues that absorbed La Peyrére's consciousness. By examining them, we can catch a glimpse of the early complicity of geographical inquiry in the radical project in which he was embroiled, and thus in what Richard Popkin has called the high road to Pyrrhonism, the 16th and 17th century revival, courtesy of Pierre Bayle, of the ancient skeptical philosophy of Pyrrho of Elis. The map of Greenland that accompanied La Peyrére's text is a useful place to begin because it gave geographical voice to some crucial ingredients in the grand profanity that La Peyrère was sculpting over the years. Having sought the advice of Gabriel Naud, medical practitioner, librarian, and scholar, and the moderately skeptical anti-Aristotelian philosopher Pierre Gassendi, in preparing his text, he called upon the expertise of the mathematician Gilles Roberval and Nicolas Sanson d'Aville, geographer to the King of France, for cartographic assistance. The map revealed La Peyrére's uncertainties about the eastern and western reaches of the subcontinent and depicted the western coastline merging with modern-day Baffin Island. Cap Favel was shown crucially separated by a stretch of ocean from Newfoundland. Thereby he expressed his disagreement with those who think that Greenland is part of the American continent and sided with the narrative of a Danish captain named John Monk, who tried this passage to the east by the northwest of the Gulf of Davis, and according to what he says there is great probability that this land is entirely separated from America. Jans Monk had led an expedition of about 30 men in 1619 and 2 ships into Hudson Bay. But the mission had to be aborted because, by June of the following year, all but 3 of the crew had died of scurvy, though the surviving remnant managed to make it back to Denmark. La Peyrére's cartographic ventures, which showed how Greenland was not geographically joined to the North American continent, were integral to his account of the settlement of the region and disclosed something of the connections between geographical investigation and Enlightenment skepticism. After all, as Paul Hazard, reflecting on the meaning of travel at the time, once quipped, geographical exploration meant comparing manners and customs, rules of life, philosophies, religions, arriving at some notion of the relative, discussing, doubting, Among those who wandered up and down the earth in order to bring the tidings of the great unknown, there was more than one freethinker. Armchair geographers of La Peyrére's stripe were no less subversive. In fact, as he disclosed in correspondence during the mid-1640s with Olworm, friend, Danish antiquarian scholar, and gifted physician and polymath at the University of Copenhagen, whom he had met during his time in Scandinavia, Louisiana, Peyrére's whole project was rooted in his passion to find a persuasive account of the origins of Native American peoples. And Worm's archaeological data provided La Peyrère with added scholarly authority. In developing his argument, La Peyrère gathered together information from both ancient and contemporary sources. Two major works in particular provided him with historical data, one of Old Icelandic origins, the other modern Danish. From a text described as the Icelandic Chronicle, possibly from the early 13th century survey of an unknown writer named Morkinskinna, La Peyrère learned of the Skrælingor people who inhabited the western flank of Greenland, and he reported that Dr. Vormius, the Olworm just mentioned, the most learned of all the doctors in northern researches, says they were the original savages of Greenland, to whom this name was probably given by the Norwegians. This was a critical intervention. It meant that the native peoples of Greenland were not descended from northern Europeans. What, then, was their origin? Two possibilities suggested themselves. Either they were of American derivation, or they were aboriginal to Greenland itself. La Peyrère believed there was no need of bringing Americans here at all, but, either way, they predated the advent of the Norwegians, and La Peyrère further suggested that by the same reasons that Vestrabug had its original inhabitants when the Norwegians arrived there, Ostrabug had them also, and that as the eastern part was nearer the Arctic Sea, was not so fertile, and consequently less inhabited than the west, the Norwegians, who met with less resistance on that side than on the other, took possession more easily of Ostrabug than of Vestrabug. This scenario found corroboration in the Danish Chronicle, probably the 1514 work of Christian Pedersen, who republished Saxo Grammaticus's 12th-century history of the Danish kings, which, La Peyrère reported, confirmed that Greenland is inhabited by a variety of races, and that these races are governed by different lords, of whom the Norwegians never knew anything. In passing, it is worth pausing to note something of the anthropological particulars that La Peyrère conveyed in his regional picture. Indeed, the richness of detail that Peter Burke has discerned in this work has suggested to him that La Peyrère had become interested in this people for their own sake and not just as a cog in the wheels of his pre-Adamite device. Drawing again on the Danish Chronicle, he depicted Greenland's indigenous peoples as savages, deceitful and ferocious, and incapable of being tamed, either by present or kindness. Additionally, they are fat but active, and their skins are of an olive color. It is believed that there are black among them like Ethiopians. The shirts of the men and the chemises of the women are made of the intestines of fish, sewn with very fine sinews. Their clothes are large, and they bind them with straps of prepared skin. They are very dirty and filthy. Yet for all that, ethnographic portraiture remains secondary to the overriding concern that animated La Peyrère's overall mission, the question, as Popkin puts it, of whether the Bible is adequate as an account of how the world developed was challenged both geographically and anthropologically by what was then known about the Americas and about the far north. If Eskimos were found in Greenland by the Viking explorers, where did they come from? Thus, in the concluding pages of his Greenland excursus, La Peyrère took the opportunity of tackling the views of the recently deceased Dutch jurist and Swedish ambassador Hugo Grotius, as recorded in a treatise by the historian and geographer George Horn, who was himself deeply critical of Grotius's Viking thesis and worked within the temporal economy of the biblical world picture. Grotius, as we have noted, had managed to get his hands on a manuscript version of La Peyrère's as yet unpublished work on the pre-Adamites and issued a scathing refutation back in 1643. Here he claimed that the native peoples of America were of Norwegian descent, and La Peyrère fastened on this assertion to deliver a biting, if belated, retaliation. His rhetorical riposte warrants quoting at length. I discover at the same time the errors of the person who has written dissertations upon the origin of the people of America, whom he makes out to have come from Greenland, and makes the first inhabitants of Greenland to have come from Norway. You will judge, sir, by the continuance and the reasoning of my history, that this author is in every way. First, inasmuch as the Norwegians were not the first inhabitants of Greenland, as it appears from his narrations and the demonstrations I have given you of them, and inasmuch as the Tem Vormius, who is very learned in the antiquities of the North, so far from connecting the origin of the people of America with the people of Greenland, thinks that the Skrælingere, the original inhabitants of Vestrabug in Greenland, came from America. Secondly, he is mistaken, inasmuch as there is little or no probability that Greenland was part of the continent of America, and that the passage from the one to the other was not so well known nor so possible as is imagined. Thirdly, he is mistaken in that which I have shown you, that there is no affinity of language or manners between Greenland and Norway, and if, as he says, the Norwegians communicated their language and manners to the Americans, they must have gone elsewhere than by Greenland to get to America. I should here have a good opportunity of showing up other errors of this dissertation, of making the author eat his own words, and of sending him to the land of visions and dreams, but as he now sleeps his last sleep, we will let him rest in quietness. La Peyrére's relation to Groenland, then, was a sustained effort to deploy physical, demographic, linguistic, and cultural evidence, to sustain his own suspicions about the adequacy of the traditional story of the development and migration of the human races in favor of one allowing for the possibility of plural origins. The earlier, and very substantially shorter, treatment of Iceland, while much less developed, nonetheless advertised similar concerns. Ethnographically, the Icelanders fared rather better than the inhabitants of Greenland in La Peyrére's geographical imaginary. Even though they inhabited the same frigid reaches, where it may rationally be supposed that a nation living so near the North Pole may not be so refined and polished as some others, he deemed it possible the Icelanders are not so barbarous as formerly. Indeed, he considered that they were very strong and courageous and had also a sufficient share of wit, and were so curious in their annals, that they not only carefully preserved their own history from oblivion, but also embellished the same with the most memorable transactions that happened in their neighboring kingdoms. These records, alongside the writings of figures such as Dithmarus Blefkenius, who had published in 1607 a work entitled Islandia, and Jonas and Arngrim, sometimes referred to, as with La Peyrère, as Angrim Jonas, who had studied with Tycho Brahe and wrote several works of Icelandic history in Latin during the early 17th century, drawing largely on Blefkenius, provided La Peyrère with information for his account. Issues of settlement chronology were never far from his thoughts, and he paused to attack those using certain classes of philological data to elucidate the genealogy of human societies. Many errors of this nature, he insisted, are to be met with in the writings of most of the best authors, who have run upon the same mistake, in looking for the true origin of nations among the interpretation or etymology of certain German or Hebrew words, which to them seem to have a near relation to the language of those nations they were treating of. Itemizing in particular the efforts of Mr. Grotius, who, in his treatise of the origin of the Americans, deduces their race from the Germans, because, says he, many of their words terminate in lan, land being a German word. La Peyrère dismissively judged that nothing can be more fallacious than conjectures founded upon such like etymologies. The Peyrérian formula. If the skeptical thrust of La Peyrére's northern geographies remained to a degree implicit, there was no mistaking its features in the superlative sacrilege he published in 1655, Pre-Adamite, or Men Before Adam. As we have already noted, a version of this work had been circulating in one form or another at least since 1641, when its banning by Cardinal Richelieu, to whom it had been dedicated, merely stimulated demand for it. Somehow it got into the hands of Marin Mersen's circle and was picked up by Hugo Grotius, to whose critique we will presently turn. Mersen himself was initially enthusiastic, judging that the work cast new light on some passages of Scripture. Over the following couple of years La Peyrère tinkered with the text in several ways and brought out one section of the work in 1643, Du Rappel des Juifs, which dwelt on his ideas about a coming Jewish Messiah. Later, during the second half of the 1640s, while he was working on his Greenland and Iceland projects, he corresponded a good deal with Ulworm, who expressed much interest in the pre-Adamite theory. So once again he returned to his pet speculation, revising and reworking it in the light of conversations with a range of interlocutors. And then in 1654, after various travels as part of the Prince of Condé's entourage, he came into contact with the recently abdicated Queen Christina of Sweden, who showed much interest in his ideas. A patron of the arts and literary culture and recent convert to Catholicism, she encouraged him to make the theory public by having it published in Amsterdam. He took her advice, and the work came out anonymously in several editions, 3 by its Dutch publisher Elsevier and at least 1 in Basel. But anonymity counted for nothing, there was no doubting who the author was. The work consisted of 2 parts, both in Latin, 52 and 260 pages, respectively, which sometimes appeared together, sometimes separately. The second part came out almost immediately in an English translation in 1655 under the title A Theological System upon the presupposition that men were before Adam. The following year the shorter first part, Men Before Adam, made its appearance. Sometimes both sections were bound into a single volume, sometimes not. Although efforts were made to suppress its English appearance, The printer Francis Leach went ahead with it nonetheless. Just whose work the translation was remains unknown, though it has been suggested that the identity of Whitford, Gent was David Whitford, author, clergyman, and sometime royalist soldier. Whatever the intricacies of its textual history, the work's central coordinating principle was beguilingly simple: human beings existed before the biblical Adam. This meant that the human species had plural origins. Peyrère was advocating polygonism. At one level, the whole enterprise was an exercise in biblical hermeneutics. As the work's subtitle made clear, a discourse upon the 12th, 13th, and 14th verses of the 5th chapter of the Epistle of the Apostle Paul to the Romans, by which are proved that men were created before Adam. Issues rotating around internal matters of biblical exegesis were of pressing concern. Here the focal point was how to interpret St. Paul's words, "Until the law, sin was in the world, but sin was not imputed, when the law was not." Peyrère found standard interpretations that took this text as referring to the Mosaic law unconvincing, and he seized on the hermeneutic ambiguity of the Apostles' declaration to argue that the law referred to was not the Mosaic law but, rather, legislative regulations given to the primeval Adam. Peyrère thereby voiced his conviction that ceremonial Judaism could be traced back beyond Moses to the Garden of Eden and thus to Adam himself. As he put it, long before Moses there were other ordinances prescribed, and commended to the Jews, other ceremonies instituted, other laws of God decreed and confirmed for that holy and elected people. And in this place, I mean the Jews, not only, the sons of Abraham who are called the seed of Abraham, but also the forefathers of Abraham, the posterity of Adam. The consequences of this interpretative move were immediate and far-reaching. There must have been human beings on earth before Adam. As he summarized his thesis, for that law was either to be understood of the law given to Moses or of the law given to Adam. If that law were understood of the law given to Adam, it must be held that sin was in the world before Adam and until Adam, but that sin was not imputed before Adam, therefore other men were to be allowed before Adam who had indeed sinned, but without imputation, because before the law sins were, not imputed. By this neat piece of exegetical reshuffling, a fresh if rather naive excursion into biblical exegesis, as Anthony Grafton puts it, a range of irritating inconsistencies in the Genesis record could be conjured out of existence. Here was a ready-made explanation for Cain's fear, after his banishment from the Garden of Eden, that he would encounter hostile individuals seeking to kill him. It delivered a population to inhabit the city he built. It provided a possible answer to the question about where his wife came from. On the standard account there simply were no other people beyond the Adamic family to make sense of these details. But now there was a simple answer: pre-Adamites. As Peyrère himself explained, ever since childhood he had been perplexed by these niggles but had only found resolution when he pondered the 5th chapter of Paul's Epistle to the Romans. As he colorfully put it, "And as he who goes upon ice, goes warily where he cracks it, being not well frozen, or tender, but where he finds it frozen, and well hardened, walks boldly, so I dreaded first, lest this doubtful dispute might either cut my soles, or throw me headlong into some deep heresy, if I should insist upon it. But so soon as I knew by these verses of the Apostle, that sin was in the world before it was imputed, and when I knew, and that certainly, that sin began from Adam to be imputed, I took heart, and found all this dispute so solid, that I passed through it with less fear." Internal textual issues, then, were the ostensible mainsprings of Peyrére's intervention, but external historical and geographical data were, if anything, even more decisive. There was, for instance, the pressure exerted by those pagan histories. Using material akin to that for his Greenland dissertation, he called non-Western chronicles, genealogies, and Renaissance travel books in search of supporting testimony, relying in particular on the recent scholarly work of figures such as Claude Salmais and Joseph Scaliger. Pre-Adamite was thus replete with details of Egyptian, Greek, Babylonian, and Chinese histories and how they challenged Christian chronology as conventionally understood. Peyrére's testy impatience with conventional writers who dismissed these records called forth biting commentary, but his geographers use, to place seas upon that place of the globe which they know not, so chronologers, who are near of kin to them, use to blot out age pasts, which they know not. They drown those countries which they know not, these with cruel pen kill the times they heard not of, and deny that which they know not. Fundamental, too, was the evidence he derived from the voyages of reconnaissance and the revelations they delivered on distant cultures and their indigenous traditions. His purpose in amassing such data, of course, was to reveal how elegantly his pre-Adamite theory could absorb them and thereby integrate faith and reason. When read in its light, Peyrère insisted, The history of Genesis appears much clearer and agrees with itself. And it is wonderfully reconciled with all profane records whether ancient or new, to wit, those of the Chaldeans, Egyptians, Scythians, and Chinensians. That most ancient creation which is set down in the first of Genesis is reconciled to those of Mexico, not long ago discovered by Columbus. It is likewise reconciled to those northern and southern nations which are not known, all whom, as likewise those of the first and most ancient creation were, it is probable, created with the earth itself and all parts thereof, and not propagated from Adam. Taken together, then, the evidence of old chronological records and new geographical findings, combined with internal biblical exegesis, played a significant role in the move toward bringing the apparatus of textual criticism to bear on the biblical documents. Extra-biblical data just had to be accorded their due role in scriptural hermeneutics, and such considerations led Peyrère to a range of more or less radical conclusions about the nature of the biblical text. He was convinced, for example, that Scripture's documentary history disclosed evidence of fallible human transcription, that Moses was not the sole author of the Pentateuch, and that Noah's flood was a local incident, not a universal event, and that many other cultures had their own flood legends. His reasoning behind the latter suggestions was, in part, a consequence of his conviction that Adam was only the father of the Jews and that it was on account of their forbidden intermarriage with Gentiles that they were judged by flood. In such circumstances the deluge was restricted to the vicinity of Palestine. The return of the dove to Noah's ark with an olive branch provided him with further supporting evidence that there were areas that remained untouched by floodwaters. For these reasons Peyrère has been seen as playing a key role in the foundation of biblical criticism. Just how subversive Peyrère intended his proposals to be is not entirely clear. Certainly, there are grounds for seeing his project as radical through and through. Leo Strauss, for example, noting that he was among the first of those who openly declared their departure from unquestioning acceptance of the Bible, was of the opinion that his recourse to Scripture, which has caused so much ridicule to be poured on Peyrère, is no more than an adventitious trimming to a naturalistic and rationalistic theory. Read in this register, Peyrère played midwife to the inauguration of modern skepticism, an intellectual genealogy that was continued by his friend and biographer, the Oratorian priest Father Richard Simon, and by the renegade Jewish philosopher Baruch Spinoza, who had a copy of Adamite in his personal library. By the same token, for all the skeptical charges that were laid at Peyrère's door, there is some reason to suppose that his aim was at least as ecumenical as it was subversive. Adopting his pre-Adamite theory, he judged, would aid the conversion to Christianity of various peoples insofar as Genesis and the Gospel, and the astronomy of the ancients is reconciled in the history and philosophy of the most ancient nations, so that if the Chaldeans themselves should come, those most ancient astronomers, who had calculated the course of the stars, as they say many 100,000 years ago, or the most ancient Egyptian chronologers, with those most ancient dynasties of their kings, they will willingly receive this history of Genesis and more willingly become Christians. As Grafton notes, by making Genesis a more reasonable text, he would make it more convincing, and thus the heathen would be more receptive to it and would more willingly convert to the true religion, Christianity. In order to appreciate any proselytizing impetus in Peyrère's enterprise, the significance of the messianic vision he elaborated in Du Rappel des Juifs, the recall of the Jews, needs to be registered. Of fundamental importance here was his concern to separate out the Jewish experience from the rest of world history. The theological fulcrum of sacred history was Judaism, and the pre-Adamite theory was designed to cut a deep gorge between the Jews and the Gentiles, namely, between the story of the Adamites and the pre-Adamites. In Peyrère's telling, the Bible's prevailing concern was with the Jewish nation, which was cast as principal in the theater of providential history. The Gentiles, or, better, pre-Adamites, merely look on as Israel's divine drama as played out in the world, although they participate in the benefits of God's election of his own people. Crucial to this vision was Peyrère's conviction that the Jews would be recalled and that this ingathering would take place in France prior to their subsequent return to Palestine. This eschatological scenario, of course, had major repercussions for the Christian world. Antisemitism had to be stamped out and Christianity's debt to its Jewish heritage more fully acknowledged. Integral to the political theology of this salvation history was what might be called Peyrère's double messianism, according to which the first-century coming of Jesus was in his role as Christian Messiah, his anticipated 17th-century return was as political Jewish Messiah. Anything that furthered this historical trajectory and fostered closer Jewish-Christian relations was to be welcomed, even if it involved sacrificing much conventional theological orthodoxy. The implications for Peyrère's France were immediate. France should admit Jews in order to hasten the nation's conversion. All in all, Peyrère's political messianism was a basic ingredient in his pre-Adamite formula, which provided a means not only of bridging the gap between Jerusalem and Christendom but also of holding in balance the Bible, scientific knowledge, concern for the Jews, and French national identity. Whatever its motivations, and whatever the aspirations of its author, Peyrère's pre-Adamite heresy had a significance of epic proportions. That he himself had some inkling of its import may be gleaned from the fact that he compared it with Copernicanism. Neither theory, he noted, changed the world, both changed how the world was viewed. The comparison with the Copernican revolution is not far off the mark. In his exploration of Isaac Peyrère in the Old Testament, for example, Grafton has made the observation that in accounting for the intellectual transformation that was effected between the burning of Noël Journet in 1582 for his querying of Scripture and Pierre Bayle's historical and critical dictionary of 1692, no one did more to make this revolution happen than the little-remembered French Calvinist Isaac Peyrère. And indeed, whether the Enlightenment's religious significance is calibrated in what Gay called the rise of modern paganism or along the lines of John Locke's reasonable Christianity, the changed status of the Bible was crucially important. This move, moreover, was not merely theoretical. In the words of Sylvia Berti, it delegitimized the presumed sacredness of the foundations of civil and ecclesiastic authority. Public denunciation, private admiration. Peyrère's pre-Adamite theory was published to a storm of critical censure. Whatever his own hopes, he found his proposals pilloried by commentators of every conceivable theological hue, not least the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. And having been duly escorted to Rome at the pleasure of Pope Alexander VII in 1657, he embarked on penning an official recantation that was so subtly phrased that he never came to the point of actually denying the existence of pre-Adamites. He announced that it was his Calvinist upbringing that had corrupted his thinking, yet contended that his opponents had failed to deliver persuasive arguments or evidence to prove his theory false. In such circumstances, he went on, the only way a controversial issue could be resolved was by appeal to an acknowledged ecclesiastical authority, namely, the Pope himself. And Peyrère submitted that he had no option but to accept papal dictate. In Popkin's opinion, the whole apology reeks of hypocrisy, a judgment supported by the fact that while living out his last days in the seminary of the Oratorian Fathers outside Paris, he continued to accumulate further evidence to support his epic heterodoxy. In the years that followed, despite the fact that the theory attracted no more than the merest handful of supporters, refutation after refutation was issued in a desperate effort to exorcise the religious mind of the ghost of the pre-Adamite. As Colin Kidd has observed, Peyrère's ethnic theology ignited one of the largest heresy hunts of the age. And indeed, scholars have enthusiastically joined in the game of tallying the number of rebuttals the work attracted. Kidd himself notes that within 11 years at least 17 works had been published with the specific aim of demolishing the doctrine. More than a century ago, Andrew Dixon White noted that his book was refuted by 7 theologians within a year after its appearance, and within a generation 36 elaborate answers to it had appeared. More recently, Grafton has been able to get the count for 1,656 alone up to 19. Whatever the arithmetic, there can be no doubt that refutation after refutation tumbled from the pens of those alarmed by the specter of the pre-Adamites. The condemnation of Grotius, into whose hands the as yet unpublished document fell, has already been noted. Using the etymology of place names, he insisted that the peoples of America were of Scandinavian descent and that they had settled the New World from Iceland and Greenland. Grotius's concern to save biblical authority prompted him to attack the idea that before Adam there were other unknown men, as has recently been imagined by some in France, a conception that brought great danger to piety. The theologian and librarian to the Queen of Sweden, Isaac Vossius, also confronted Peyrère's doctrine in his account of the world's origins, in which he sought to provide for a longer chronology through using the Septuagint version, as did Edward Stillingfleet, instead of the Masoretic text, of the Old Testament. In his view, Peyrère's reliance on heathen records was both wrong-headed and perverse. Much better, he insisted, to use Gentile annals in such a way as to confirm sacred history. His own reworking of dates from the Septuagint rather than the Masoretic Bible, he believed, had shown the right way forward. The greater length of time afforded by using this text, it gained him nearly 1,500 years, could even accommodate, he reasoned, Chinese dynasties, which, some had worried, looked as though they predated the flood. At the same time he expressed his own doubts about the worldwide nature of the Noachian deluge, insisting only on its demographic universality. Apart from anything else, Voss was convinced that there was insufficient water on the earth to submerge all land. Voss's strategy, however, was not uniformly appealing. George Horne immediately shot back a rebuttal in which he alleged that Voss was a disciple of the mad law Peyrère, who had embarked on the task of undermining the authority of Scripture. To Horne, that enterprise led straight into the arms of atheism and served only to harm the Church. However laudable Voss's intention, it was in the last analysis dangerous and harmful to the Church. He preferred simply to dismiss alternative world genealogies as fabulous. Edward Stillingfleet, the Orthodox Anglican Bishop of Worcester and author of Origenes Acres in 1662, was certain that the peopling of the world from Adam is of great consequence for us to understand, not only for the satisfaction of our curiosity as to the true origin of nations, but also in order to our believing the truth of the Scriptures, and of the universal effects of the fall of man. Indeed, his whole treatise was conducted in the hope that no more would be heard of men before Adam to salve the authority of the Scriptures, a scheme, he noted, in fact intended only as a design to undermine them. In a nutshell, the hypothesis of pre-Adamites is undoubtedly false and could only be described as a fiction. His own strategy was to argue for the ambiguity and thus unreliability of those historical records and thereby to reduce them to the status of the merely fabulous. To Stillingfleet, the records of the Chaldeans and Egyptians were simply pretended antiquities. It bothered him, too, that pagan chronology was often the weapon of choice in the arsenal of crusading atheists. As he put it, the most popular pretenses of the atheists of our age have been the irreconcilableness of the account of times in Scripture with that of the learned and ancient heathen nations. To Stillingfleet, a range of fundamental Christian doctrines rested on the assumption of worldwide human descent from Adam, and any tampering with that foundation would result in the collapse of the entire edifice of biblical anthropology. England's Lord Chief Justice, Sir Matthew Hale, jurist, natural philosopher, and religious writer, was similarly disturbed and told the readers of his posthumously published defense of the Mosaic narrative, The Primitive Origination of Mankind, in 1677, that the Peyrérian formula would necessarily not only weaken but overthrow the authority and infallibility of the sacred Scripture. These rejoinders were typical of a flood of responses dwelling on the theological heterodoxy of La Peyrére's proposals that had been in full flow ever since pre-Adamite saw the first light of day. Take, for example, three works that appeared in 1656, just the year after the publication of his work. The French clergyman and Leiden professor of Hebrew Antonius Holschuss brought the full weight of his antisemitism to bear on pre-Adamism. Because he considered the Jews to be the root cause of all heresy and speculation, he found La Peyrére's project theologically repugnant. Nothing strange to the Christian truth, he insisted, has been introduced in the Church, which does not smell of this corrupted Judaism. The controversial, though influential, French Calvinist professor at Groningen Samuel Desmarets, Mauritius, who engaged in critical dialogue with a range of theological systems, also took on the challenge, arguing, in a critique that was later taken up by Diderot, that in essence the heretical pre-Adamite doctrine could be traced back to figures such as Maimonides and Paracelsus. He thus sided with the opinion of the Calvinist pastor James Trezat that La Peyrére's treatise merited nothing more than being consigned to the flames because darkness could have nothing to do with light. And in the same year, 1656, the Lutheran theologian Johann Dannhauer, who occupied the position of professor of rhetoric at Strasbourg, devoted over 500 pages to a theological critique of the fable. These repudiations are indicative of the flurry of consternation that La Peyrére's heresy stirred up during the mid-1600s, and Richard Popkin has been able to identify more than 24 anecdotes appearing in print before the century was out. Indeed, something of the hostile conditions into which the book was launched may be gleaned from the fact that numerous extant copies are to be found bound together with works refuting the doctrine. In these circumstances, sympathizers were well advised to keep any admiration they might entertain for the schema to themselves or at most share it with tried and trusted friends. Just how many secret supporters there were is impossible to ascertain, of course. But there is evidence that this strategy was adopted by at least some. Thanks to the researches of William Poole, a couple of English advocates of pre-Adamism, who express their opinions in private, have come to the surface. In the case of Francis Lodwick, a religiously heterodox London merchant and Fellow of the Royal Society, who played an early role in bringing philosophical perspectives to bear on language, the motivation sprang largely from linguistic concerns. In print he confined himself to strictly technical matters, in such works as A Common Writing and the Groundwork, and in his proposals for a phonetic alphabet, which he published in the Royal Society's Philosophical Transactions in 1686. In private his mind ranged wider. Unpersuaded by the standard narrative of the origin of language as a divinely given, perfect Adamic creation, which laid emphasis on the Genesis fall from grace and the Babel episode as the two confusions explaining both its corruption and variety. Lodwick opted in his personal memoirs for a polygynist account that stressed the arbitrary nature of speech and its diverse sources. His own work on the Irish language confirmed him in these judgments. He simply found it impossible to see in the confusion of Babel a persuasive explanation for a language without affinity to other continental tongues. Had Irish resulted from the Babel judgment, traces of its dispersal would have been left by migrants who eventually found their way to Ireland. An entirely independent origin of Irish seemed much more plausible. It was the same, too, with Welsh, Slavonic, and Dutch, which he deemed incompatible languages. Besides all this, Lodwick could see other benefits in La Peyrére's offering, not least of which was that it allowed him to retain his preconceptions about the fundamental difference between black and white races. And yet, however central La Peyrère-style pre-Adamism was to Lodwick's philosophical linguistics, it remained for him a secret, heretical allegiance at best only hinted at in public discourse. Unlike Lodwick, whose proposals were in substantial measure grounded in La Peyrére's speculations, he reportedly owned both Latin and English versions of pre-Adamite. The second, anonymous supporter seems to have cultivated his own version of the pre-Adamite theory independently of the continental source. The existence of worlds before the biblical Adam is certainly used to make sense of some conventional conundrums that had long bothered Bible readers, the behavior of Cain after the slaying of his brother and the identity of the sons of gods who took wives from the sons of men. But the inspiration for positing a pre-Adamite universe was much more metaphysical than textual and showed no interest in questions of chronology or geography. It was derived, rather, from a Neoplatonic conception of divine necessity that supposed that God necessarily and eternally engaged in works of creation as a consequence of the nature of his being. The eternity of the world, and the existence of pre-Adamites, were nothing less than the expressions of an inescapable divine impulse to create. Yet for all the condemnation heaped on the theory, and for all the dangers associated with it, a number of more open advocates of pre-Adamism, of one stripe or another, are discernible. Typically, however, when the pre-Adamites did surface, they were to be found in the dubious company of radicals, skeptics, or esoterics. In certain fringe religious circles in England, for example, the idea showed up from time to time, in some cases even predating the publication of La Peyrére's system. Indeed, Philip Hammond maintains that pre-Adamitism was probably a not uncommon belief during the Revolutionary period, as much for its fostering of an increasing desire to contest dominant readings of the Bible with more personal and individual ones as for the need to account for stories about Indians or challenges to chronology. Lawrence Clarkson, a Mugglitonian, a radical millenarian group that held the soul to be mortal and found no need for formal religious ceremonies, reflected on his youthful, wilder days in the 1650s, when he had denied that Adam was the first creature, but that there was a creation before him. Judging that land of Nod where Cain took his wife, was inhabited a long time before Cain. And Gerard Winstanley, a member of the agrarian reformist group the Diggers, warned against literalistic readings of the Genesis account, highlighting the contradictions and absurdities such hermeneutics would deliver. To him the idea that Cain was the third man in the world could not be taken literally because a few verses later Bible readers were told that he needed protection from others who would seek to take his life. To Winstanley it was obvious that there were men in the world before that time, namely, the time of Adam. The English freethinker, libertine, and disciple of Hobbes Charles Blount, who was accused by Josiah King of adopting pre-Adamism, plainly told the readers of his Oracles of Reason, published just before his death in 1693, that there were two creations both of man and woman, and that Adam was not the first man, nor Eve the first woman, only the first of the holy race. It was simply one of the great errors committed in the manner of reading Scripture to imagine that Adam was the father of all humankind. Any sensible hermeneutic would recognize that Moses made Adam only to be the first father of the Jews, whilst others hyperbolically make him to be the first father of all men, and that Noah's flood only covered the land of the Jews. In a later generation versions of pre-Adamism, following this latter trajectory, were deployed for increasingly skeptical purposes. Voltaire, for example, doubted that the peoples of the Americas were of Noachic descent and urged that Chinese and Indian genealogies massively predated biblical antiquity. In Voltaire's case an anti-Semitic spirit was mobilized to undercut Christian claims about the origins of the world. By rocking the foundations on which Judaism was erected, Christianity would be destabilized. Moreover, as Colin Kidd puts it, in Voltaire's deistic brand of anti-Semitism, the Hebrews were parvenus, their Abraham a corruption of the Hindu Brahma and Adam an obvious derivation from Adamo, the first Indian. If Voltaire's interventions may be taken to symbolize the skeptical ends to which pre-Adamic theorizing could be put, its association with esoterics is nowhere more conspicuous than in the case of the Irish parliamentarian and barrister-at-law Francis Dobbs. In a note dealing with La Peyrére's proposals and his account of the rise of rationalism in Europe, W.E.H. Lecky insisted that existence of a race of men not descended from Adam was very strenuously maintained by an eccentric member of the Irish Parliament named Dobbs. While Popkin queries the claim that Dobbs endorsed the idea of non-Adamic humans descended from an intrigue of Eve and the devil, contending that this interpretation rests on a misreading of his interpretation of Genesis in his universal history, Dobbs did in fact elaborate on the idea at length in the published 1800 version of a set of 25 letters addressed to his eldest son. Here, in the 21st installment of A Concise View, from History and Prophecy, of the Great Predictions in the Sacred Writings, Dobbs spelled out his belief that there are two distinct races of men, the one from God through Adam, the other through a creation of the devil. Central to Dobbs's scheme was the proposal that the world was peopled by two quite separate races. The first, descended from Adam, was destined for immortality, but there was another race upon the earth, that had not their origin from God. This other race was the offspring of the devil, and it was among them that Cain, who himself had Satan's nature, settled and took a wife when he was banished from the Garden of Eden. The descendants of this race were corrupt from inception and fated for annihilation. Intriguingly, Dobbs also hinted at the possibility of a hybrid race springing from a union of these two creations, though he did not further develop the idea. As he reflected on the early chapters of Genesis, now here are, in the plainest terms, two distinct races pointed out. The one sprung from Adam, who was the son of God, and of course his offspring were the sons of God also, and another race, distinguished by the name of men only, and from the blenditure of the two, a spurious race, but which had only, in regard to life, what belonged to that race that had its origin from Satan. There Dobbs left matters. But the esoteric Irish millennialism, according to which the Messiah would return first to Ireland, the Battle of Armageddon being appropriately staged in Armagh, before going on to Palestine, into which his polygenetic account was inserted, discloses something of the arcane atmosphere in which advocates of non-Adamic humans sometimes crystallized. For Lecky this hibernicized eschatology, which drew on Isaac Newton's commentary on the books of Daniel and Revelation, and which he delivered in a speech to the Irish House of Commons in June 1800, had immediate political ramifications. The special place of Ireland in the divine economy underwrote the nation's independence. Ireland's freedom from British colonial dominance was written in the immutable records of heaven. Biblical prophecy, evidently, confirmed Dobbs's radical views on Ireland's constitutional right to formulate its own laws. Regardless of its eccentricities, the speech was a runaway success, and 30,000 copies were immediately sold. Whatever its taint of heresy, and despite the unsavory company in which the idea frequently surfaced, there were nonetheless those who felt themselves attracted to pre-Adamism, even if they could not bring themselves to embrace it fully. In some cases half-hearted rejection was the outcome, not least because they could see the theory's potential to resolve mounting tensions that conventional readings of sacred texts increasingly faced. Others set about modifying the basic Peyrérian formula to suit their own purposes. Nathaniel Lardner, a nonconformist scholar whose theological convictions developed from Baxterian Calvinism through Arminianism to a modified Arianism, for example, flirted with a version of the theory but could not quite come to accept it, whatever its attractions. His greatest achievements were his Credibility of the Gospel History, published between 1727 and 1757, and a large collection of ancient Jewish and heathen testimonies to the truth of the Christian religion, a 4-volume treatise issued between 1764 and 1767. In these works he strove to defend the authenticity of the Bible against deistic critics. Certainly, Lardner's own reading of the Genesis narrative was self-confessedly literalistic, but in an essay he penned in 1753 on the subject of the creation and the fall, he admitted that there were not a few difficulties in the account, which Moses has given of the world, and of the formation, and temptation, and fall of our first parents. The greatest of these rotated around the question of human origins, and Lardner conceded that the belief that all mankind have proceeded from one pair, the sheet anchor of the Christian conception of creation, could not be established with absolute certainty from contemporary empirical evidence without the bolstering support of Scripture. Indeed, he did come to the point of confessing that many pairs, resembling each other, might have been formed by God, the Creator, at once, in several, and remote countries, that the earth might be peopled thereby. This suggestion, that there may have been co-Adamites, if not pre-Adamites, was one that had already begun to receive an airing during the mid-18th century. The idea here was that God had created several humans in different locations at the same time as Adam. Lardner himself felt constrained to reject this possibility but diffidently added that the account of Moses, I suppose, may be relied upon. This left him with the need to find some means of explaining the source of racial differentiation, and he was forced to resort to the difference of climates, with the varieties of air, earth, water, as the means of making sensible alterations and differences in one and the same species. Moreover, Lardner did not hesitate to point to what he saw as the moral implications of the Mosaic monogenetic account, namely, that common descent from the same parents should abate exorbitant pride and reaffirm the universal brotherhood of the human race. Yet Lardner's rejection of polyganism was anything but vigorous, and his denial of it was such that its attractions were plainly displayed for all to see. Whereas Lardner could not bring himself to endorse co-atomism, others less unnerved by charges of heresy found in this option a means of retaining pre-atomism's explanatory power while deflecting its heterodoxy. To them the co-Adamite rendition presented real possibilities because it removed the stigma attached to the notion that the world was inhabited before Adam. This version was anonymously promulgated in 1732 in a 59-page tract entitled Co-Adamite, or an essay to prove the two following paradoxes, viz. 1. That there were other men created at the same time with Adam, and 2. That the angels did not fall. The author's main objective was to relieve internal tensions in the biblical narrative by answering exegetical questions such as where Cain got his wife, why he had cause to fear when he fled Eden, and who peopled his city and supplied building materials. To this anonymous writer the conventional interpretation did violence both to divine economy and to common sense. For the former it was plain that Adam singly, neither could use, nor attain the benefit of all the other creatures, therefore there were more men than Adam, some to attend his particular service, and others which God distributed, to reap the increase of more remote parts of the earth. On the latter score it was incredible to conjecture that Adam could have attended to a globe whose circuit, according to the most modest compute of all geographers, is 226,000 Italian miles. Besides, there were places where the name Adam was not a denomination solely appropriated to one, that is, to an individual, but, rather, was a label that signifies man indefinitely, namely, generically. As for the doctrine of original sin, the author proposed that Adam's action was representative of all humanity in something like the way princes, when they make a league with any neighbor king, do not only oblige themselves faithfully to observe such articles as are then agreed to, but their subjects also, at least inclusively, though they are not at all made privy to his proceedings. Evidently, humanity was implicated in Adam's transgression representatively, not genealogically. Taken overall, then, this account was essentially theological and exegetical in its intent and scope, but subsequently, as we shall see, this selfsame system was advanced with rather more scientific objectives in mind. It is time to pause and take stock of pre-atomism's fortunes thus far. While the context within which the pre-Adamite was talked about was almost invariably theological, it would clearly be mistaken to think of that vocabulary as hermetically sealed off from other fields of discourse. Indeed, it was not so much that there were a range of demarcated conversations, geographical, anthropological, theological, and so on, between which there was cross-communication. Rather, geographical and anthropological considerations were simply part of the theological frame of reference, and vice versa. Of course, this does not mean that there was universal agreement among the conversationalists. And as we have seen, advocates of pre-atomism, either by self-appointment or public accusation, frequently found themselves marginalized on the skeptical fringes of the interchange. All this, however, would soon change as pre-Adamite vocabulary, in one form or another, became more common in the emerging language of the human sciences. Time, texts, and talk. Whatever was to be made of La Peyrére's intervention, things could never be the same afterward. The monumental heresy to which he gave voice was at once remarkably simple: there were humans on earth before Adam, and yet extraordinarily far-reaching. However superficial the scholarship of La Peyrère himself may have been, Richard Simon, his friend and correspondent, thought his learning extremely limited and complained of his ignorance of both Greek and Hebrew. Such was the theory's conceptual versatility that it swept into its orbit a wide range of matters occupying the minds of contemporary thinkers. Thus, while Grafton observes that La Peyrére's erudition disappears on inspection, he at once adds that his intelligence was correspondingly all the more impressive. La Peyrère fused for a poignant moment the popular skepticism that could call any text into question and a few powerful fragments of learned scholarship. The combination was potent enough to stimulate, to split, and eventually transform the world of learning to which he never really belonged. The pre-Adamite theory forced open new possibilities in at least three scholarly arenas, which can be grouped under these labels: time, texts, and talk, just some of the more conspicuous intellectual regions into which the pre-Adamite theory was catapulted. Pre-Adamism had a direct bearing on matters of time. It challenged standard accounts of the age of the world and the understanding of humanity's deep past and its foreseeable future. It also raised fundamental questions about how ancient texts, not least sacred texts, were composed and how they should be read. And it provoked troubling questions about the origins and nature of human language and of human beings themselves. Time. Peyrére's postulation of a pre-Adamic cosmos had profound implications both for time past and for time future. It was, in part, to meet the challenges arising from world chronology that his theory was brought into the orbit of those seeking to come to grips with competing conceptions of the human past. Peyrére's program, moreover, was highly imaginative in that it retained the standard dates for biblical chronology even while opening the gateway to infinite times past. His own conception of post-Adamic time was entirely in keeping with the conventional conception of roughly 4,000 years that the Latin Vulgate had assigned to the epoch between the creation of Adam and the birth of Christ. But by drawing back the curtain on an endlessly extended pre-Adamic cosmos, he uncovered a mechanism by which the annals of the Chaldeans, Chinese, Egyptians, Phoenicians, Scythians, and what he described as the yet undiscovered Antipodean worlds could be embraced. Thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions, of years could be accommodated without disturbing the customary chronicles of the Adamic narrative. It delivered a remarkable concordance. The idea of infinite time, moreover, impelled Peyrère to ponder the possibilities of infinite space and cosmic geography. And indeed, later generations would likewise link questions about how to think about primeval time with issues rotating around the plurality of worlds. Massively extended past time, however, was only part of the temporal dimensions of Peyrére's pre-Adamite project. As we have already seen, his pre-Adamite theory was intimately intertwined with an eschatological future that granted pride of place to the Jews. Their anticipated restoration, that is, the reuniting of the Adamic stock, courtesy of a massively retracted Christianity, would presage their return to the land of Israel and the ushering in of the millennial kingdom. His idiosyncratic biblical hermeneutics were, at least in part, designed to preserve the Old Testament as an exclusively Jewish domain. Peyrére's pre-Adamite scheme, however heretical its opponents deemed it to be, thus opened up debate on both past and future time. Pagan chronology and the Judeo-Christian eschaton alike were folded into the fabric of his eccentric speculation. Texts. Another suite of intellectual concerns congregating around how to read ancient texts, particularly the Bible, and how such canonical authorities had been subject to compositional editing, was dramatically engaged in the wake of Peyrére's interventions. Now it became increasingly difficult to maintain that the Bible was the sole authoritative account of human origins, and this suspicion, taken with Peyrére's own doubts about the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch and his observations on the unreliability of the Textus Receptus, served to keep public consciousness of the pre-Adamite theory firmly tied to skeptical moorings. Given that he considered Scripture a heap of copy confusedly taken, it is hardly surprising that Peyrére's preterism should be stagecast by W. E. H. Lecky as a kind of halfway house toward free thought, and that Andrew Dixon White, in his pugilistic recounting of the warfare between science and religion, should not hesitate to marshal Peyrère in the cause of reason over dogma. For in his wake it became harder to accept the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch uncritically, it became harder to approach ancient sacred texts with unalloyed reverence, and it became harder to ignore extra-biblical data in scriptural hermeneutics. In the interim between his vilification as a heretic and his canonization as a heroic martyr, the Galileo of the exegetes, the stream of textual criticism that Peyrère opened up widened into a flood. Within a generation, Anthony Grafton remarks, far deeper thinkers, who normally denied that they owed him any debts, would stand beside him in the moat, using far more powerful engines to besiege the castle of biblical authority. The Jewish thinker Benedict Spinoza denied the absolute authority of the Old Testament, insisting that its message was addressed to primitive Jews in categories meaningful to them, not to modern society. The Catholic writer Richard Simon resorted to the most recent Near Eastern scholarship to prove beyond reasonable doubt that the Pentateuch was a mosaic of lost earlier texts. And the Protestant Isaac Vossius, like Peyrère, an admirer of ancient Egypt and modern China, would influentially insist that one must follow the Greek text of the Old Testament, which gave a longer chronology than the Hebrew, in order to resolve the problems Peyrère had brought to light. Whatever the direct genealogy of these latter proposals, and whatever their indebtedness, or lack of it, to Peyrère, There is no doubt that his theory raised fundamental hermeneutical questions. In bringing together pagan sources and biblical interpretation, Peyrère believed he was combing out exegetical snarls that had long perturbed conservative exegetes. For this reason Peyrère plausibly takes his place as a prime mover in the inauguration of modern biblical criticism. The pre-Adamite theory, as we have seen, was also profoundly implicated in speculations about the origins and development of language and whether human speech had degenerated from a pristine past or progressed from primitive antecedents. By proposing the existence of humans, and therefore language, before Adam, it was profoundly troubling to those for whom Adam's speech was the foundation of all human speech. Thus, George Dalgarno, ca. 1620–87, an Aberdonian schoolmaster and preacher, whose work on the genesis of language was influential, found it necessary to contest pre-Adamite speculations. His own careful philosophical theological analysis of the relationship between Adam's perfect, but not divinely determined, speech and its imperfect state in the wake of both the fall and Babel amounted to nothing more than a belated, contingent set of events, if indeed human language was spoken by pre-Adamic beings created separately across the face of the earth. The pre-Adamites deeply disturbed the fundamental architecture of Dalgarno's theory of Adamic naming, in which he sought to explain Adam's linguistics as both the natural consequence of divine creation and an arbitrary system of signification. The search for the perfect language, as Umberto Eco styles it, was a long obsession with language thinkers. The passion to recover the lost perfection of speech in paradise, where there was what Eco calls a primordial affinity between words and objects, took many forms. St. Augustine and most of the early Church Fathers were convinced that primeval Hebrew was the primary and perfect language. In the 14th century Dante sought less for a specific language than for a more generic form of speech, formal locutionis, which had been lost after the Babel episode. A little earlier Boethius of Dacia thought it possible to distill a universal grammar from existing languages and thus to catch a glimpse of the lost language of Adam. In the mid-16th century Conrad Gessner, sharing the Hebrew hypothesis, claimed that all existing languages contain traces of corrupted Hebrew vocabulary. Others, such as John Wilkins and Dalgarno during the 17th century, sought in different ways to create an entirely rational, universal language, based on a rigorous system of classification, that recovered the essence of Eden's lost speech. Peyrére's advocacy of entire pre-Adamic worlds was not so much a challenge to these particular proposals as a massive undermining of the entire enterprise of searching for any perfect Adamic language. For that project presupposed linguistic monogenism, the idea that all languages had developed from a single Edenic mother tongue. By contrast, Peyrére's system was resolutely polygenetic, and therefore polylingual. As Paolo Rossi summarizes it, Peyrère proposes no theories concerning the rise and development of language among the pre-Adamites. He limits himself to showing that traditional solutions to the problem were untenable. Eco concurs, commenting on the proposals of the heretic Peyrère. Quite apart from the obvious theological implications of such an assumption, and the works of Peyrère were condemned to be burned, it was clear that, by now, Hebrew civilization, along with its holy language, was falling from its throne. If one accepted that species had developed differentially in differing conditions, and that their linguistic capacity reflected their degree of evolution and of adaptation to environment, it was easy to accept the polygenetic hypothesis. Whether or not contemporaries found linguistic polygonism an easy hypothesis to accept is open to debate. But the fact is that Peyrère had opened the door to a more general anthropological polygonism, which was taken up in one way or another in generations to come. It earned for him an acknowledged place in the early history of the human sciences. In Peyrére's scheme, polygonism was bereft of its later associations with certain forms of racial prejudice. Indeed, its thrust was profoundly humanitarian inasmuch as it sought to integrate all peoples within the divine economy and rejected any notion of racial superiority, even of the Jews, through whom the redemption of the world was secured. It is important to register these sentiments because it is frequently assumed that polygonism was necessarily implicated in a racist ideology. Indeed, one recent set of commentators has egregiously blamed Peyrère for establishing the polygonist basis for racism, and that is pre-Adamites were descended from a different Adam and hence sundered from true men, which means primarily Europeans. Such accusations are entirely without foundation. Besides its reformulation of human ancestry, Peyrére's theory had more general biogeographical implications. Some of them were seized upon by a Dutch naturalist, Abraham van der Mil, who used it to argue that the entire fauna of a new world, animal as well as human, had been separately created. Then there was Peyrére's suggestion that the Mosaic flood was not universal. Even critics of pre-Adamism could find this idea attractive, as in the case of Bishop Stillingfleet, who, while fiercely repudiating the suggestion of the existence of men and women before Adam, nevertheless found the idea of a local flood distinctly appealing. For him the deluge was demographically, not geographically, universal. Nor did he consider that it wiped out all other plant and animal life. For what reason can there be to extend the flood beyond the occasion of it, which was the corruption of mankind? Indeed, even while defending the monogenetic origin of the human race with all vigor, he was entirely sanguine about what might be called animal polygonism as an explanation for worldwide biogeographical distributions. But because he believed that all humankind at the time dwelled in the Near East, no larger geographical scope was required for the flood.